Chapter 1. Thomas Taylor looked at the tombstone and asked me with difficulty, "Your ex was born in 1969? I thought for a moment, then firmly replied, "That's right, men age like fine wine." The photo on the tombstone of the uncle looked very dashing. I could only silently apologize in my heart. "Sorry, uncle, but I've endured this for too long, and today I have to let it out." Thomas Taylor's face turned pale as he asked, "Hannah Lewis, what do you mean by this? Are you deliberately trying to upset me?" I wiped my face. "Thomas Taylor, every year, you get to come here and honor your so-called white moonlight. So why can't I shed a few tears for my old baby?" He immediately flew into a rage. "If I had known you were such a shameless woman, I would never have dated you." I opened the compact powder case and touched up my makeup slightly. Calmly, I said, "Perfect timing. I don't want to continue this either. Let's break up." I've seen people break up on the street, but I've never seen anyone break up in a cemetery. Thomas Taylor stormed off in anger. I also turned to leave, but suddenly, I heard a voice from behind. "Son, I knew it. Your father has someone else, and now I've caught him red-handed." A well-dressed middle-aged woman stood there, her finger pointing sharply. "Explain yourself. What's your relationship with Ethan Page?" Beside her was a man in uniform, holding a bouquet of white chrysanthemums. I quickly explained, "Ma'am, I don't know your husband at all. This is just a misunderstanding." She didn't believe me, and grabbed my hand tightly. "Then why were you crying so sorrowfully in front of that gravestone?" For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Luckily, the man stepped in to defuse the situation. "Mom, stop creating a scene. Don't you already know what kind of person Dad is?" The woman's face was full of sorrow as she began recounting her husband's indifference toward her over the years. Finally, as she spoke, she broke down in tears in front of the gravestone. It was only then that I noticed the man in the portrait on the headstone was wearing a police uniform. It seemed familiar, as if I had recently seen it in the news. He was a police officer who had died in the line of duty. "I know I've committed a grave mistake." Apologizing while expressing my deep regret. Finally, I managed to soothe this overly sentimental woman. When I got home, I packed up all the gifts Thomas Taylor had given me and threw them all away. To hell with him and his white moonlight, I can't take it anymore. Honestly, I understand why he pursued me, it's simply because I bear some resemblance to that white moonlight of his. But after being together, I completely realized something. The living can never compete with the dead. A year has 24 solar terms, 7 major holidays, birthdays, and memorial days. He has to visit the cemetery for all of them. At this rate. Next, he should go ahead and purchase a burial plot next to Bai Noyet Kwong so that in the future, after his death, he could still be her neighbor. But I never expected that after our breakup, Thomas Taylor would desperately beg to get back together. Every day, he would wait for me outside my office building. He would pick me up and drop me off, morning and night. Occasionally, he even prepared flowers and heart-shaped breakfasts. Even though I had made it clear that we were over. I am not a replacement for anyone, yet he still refused to give up. Thomas Taylor is my boss. Although not my direct supervisor, he exploited workplace rules to pressure my superior. He forced me to comply. When he couldn't achieve his goal, he used the excuse of a client party to coerce me into accompanying him to drink. I looked at the balance in my bank account. My mother's surgery costs for next month still hadn't been covered. Right now, I couldn't afford to lose this job. I had no choice but to grit my teeth and follow along. A group of old men sat drinking, boasting at the banquet table, while women were merely decorations, used to create an atmosphere. Thomas Taylor forced me to drink. He threatened, "Hannah Lewis, your mother is still in the hospital waiting for money." I gritted my teeth and tilted my head back, taking a large gulp of alcohol. The old men clapped and cheered. When the party ended, I was so drunk I could barely stand. Thomas Taylor helped me into the car. In the dim underground parking lot, I suddenly noticed a strange look in his eyes. Hannah Lewis, I told you, you can't escape from the palm of my hand. His gaze behind the glasses grew increasingly sinister, like a predator that had caught the scent of blood. I used what little consciousness I had left to struggle, but my strength was no match for his. When I tried to grab my phone to call the police, Thomas Taylor suddenly pulled out a fruit knife from his pocket. The cold blade pressed against the artery in my neck. I sobered up halfway. What do you want? Thomas Taylor opened his phone and gestured. I'd booked a hotel room across the street. Spend the night with me, and I'll let you go. Keep dreaming. He used force, the blade's sharp pain pressing against me. At this moment, if I dared to resist, I'd surely make the crime news headlines tomorrow. All right, I'll go with you, I said. He forced me to link arms with him, making us look like an ordinary couple walking out together. My legs wobbled slightly, and he took the chance to wrap his arm around my waist. Outside, the sky was gradually darkening, and the hotel was just across the street. The traffic light began its countdown. If I crossed the road, I would lose any chance to escape. Suddenly, I spotted a familiar figure. It was the police officer in uniform whom I had met that day at the cemetery. He was about to cross the road from the opposite side. The red light turned green. The crowd started moving, and just as we were about to pass each other, I suddenly shouted loudly, "Honey, save me." Christopher Carter is a police officer with a high level of vigilance. It took him just a second to react, immediately realizing I was in danger. Seizing the opportunity, I broke free from Thomas Taylor and stumbled into Christopher's arms. The gazes of those around us began to focus on us. Thomas Taylor angrily protested, "Hannah Lewis, you're my girlfriend." Clinging tightly to Christopher Carter's sleeve as if grabbing a lifeline, I delivered the best performance of my life. "Honey, I was wrong. I shouldn't have sought another man. Please forgive me." Chapter 2. If I don't mess up this relationship now, Thomas Taylor could easily use his status as a boyfriend to forcibly take me away. Perhaps my acting skills are too convincing. The people around have started criticizing my immoral behavior. Christopher Carter sat down and helped me up from the ground. "It's okay, your husband has forgiven you." As soon as he said this, the crowd around us focused their attention on us. Thomas Taylor grabbed my hand tightly. "Hannah Lewis, what kind of madness is this? If you keep causing trouble, I will." Before he could finish his sentence, Christopher Carter twisted his arm behind his back and forced him to the ground. Requesting support at South High Road. 10 minutes later, 2 local police officers arrived. They escorted Thomas Taylor into the police car. My limbs went limp, and I collapsed to the ground, the wound on my neck throbbing dully. One of the officers greeted Christopher Carter with a nod. "Captain Carter, how should we handle this?" He furrowed his brows slightly and spoke softly. "Take him back to the station and file a report for disturbing public order. I'll come by later." After the officers took Thomas Taylor away, he turned back to me, extending a hand to help me up. "How are you feeling? Can you walk on your own?" I nodded. "Thank you, Captain Carter." It was just a polite remark. I didn't expect him to seriously ask me back, "How do you plan to thank me?" I checked my bank account, it had only 200,000 VND left. I could only treat him to a street-side meal. Unexpectedly, he chuckled softly. "I was just joking." Christopher Carter took me back to the station to file a report. Noticing the scratches on my hand, he handed me a Band-Aid. "If something like this happens again, don't panic. Call the police immediately." I nodded firmly. Who could have known that a man I'd known for years could lose his humanity like that? After finishing the report at the station, Thomas Taylor viciously warned me. If I didn't agree to a settlement, he would make sure I couldn't have peace at work. Besides, he hadn't caused me any severe harm. I had no other choice but to sign the settlement agreement. After leaving the station, Thomas Taylor changed his attitude, promising to promote and give me a raise. He even begged me not to let this matter get out. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to live peacefully at the company. I thought about it for a moment, adding one problem is worse than resolving one, so I agreed. Little did I know that this agreement would almost cost me my life. After returning to the company, Thomas Taylor didn't cause me trouble for a while. But every day after work, he would wait outside the company. He would bother me, insisting on giving me a ride home. Hannah, can you give me another chance? I promise I'll forget about her. Let's start over again. I sighed. A once-lost white moonlight. Overcoming it all. There is absolutely no chance for us to start over again. Thomas Taylor leaned against the steering wheel, overwhelmed with pain. I only did those extreme things because I loved you too much. I knew I couldn't stay at this company any longer. So, I immediately handed over my tasks and prepared to resign. Changed my phone number and moved to a new place. Completely severed ties with everyone from before. But I never expected Thomas Taylor to somehow track down my new address. In the middle of the night, he knocked on my door. Frantically, begging for my forgiveness. I took out my phone and called the police. When they arrived, Thomas Taylor pretended to explain. He claimed he was just apologizing to his girlfriend and had no intention of disturbing anyone at night. The police, seeing it as merely a domestic matter, gave him a brief warning and left. I really had no other choice. Suddenly, I remembered the business card Christopher Carter had given me last time. Gritting my teeth, I called him. Captain Carter, someone is harassing me. Can you come and help me? Sure, send me the address, I'll be there right away. Christopher Carter arrived very quickly. Thomas Taylor, intimidated by his presence, left immediately. I opened the door to let him in. I'm sorry for bothering you. I really didn't know what else to do. Christopher Carter seemed like he wanted to say something, but decided against it. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions? He was still in his uniform. It was clear he hadn't finished work yet and had rushed over. Of course, go ahead. Christopher Carter carefully asked about how I had gotten to know Thomas Taylor. He even hinted, while you were together, did you notice anything unusual about him? I thought for a long while. Aside from his obsessive feelings for his ex-girlfriend, Thomas Taylor could actually be considered an ideal boyfriend. Wealthy family, exceptional abilities, and already a senior executive at a young age. Suddenly, an image popped into my mind. If we're talking about something strange, there is one thing. Thomas Taylor treats his ex-girlfriend's parents exceptionally well, but I feel like the two of them seem somewhat afraid of him. Thinking back, every holiday, Thomas Taylor would visit his ex-girlfriend's parents. They live in an old residential area without an elevator, making mobility inconvenient. Thomas Taylor even rented them an apartment in a more central and convenient location. During holidays, he never missed bringing gifts and red envelopes. There was one time he even took me to visit them. When they saw me, the two of them seemed uneasy. But towards Thomas Taylor, they appeared very cautious. The ex-girlfriend's mother prepared lunch for us, but just because there were a few scallions in the soup, Thomas Taylor's face darkened. Daisy Lohan never eats scallions. At that moment, I secretly cursed in my heart. He remembers that his ex-girlfriend doesn't eat scallions, yet he keeps pouring ginger sauce into my bowl even though I can't stand ginger. With just one sentence from Thomas Taylor, the ex-girlfriend's mother immediately took the soup away and apologized carefully. Christopher Carter frowned. From what you're saying, their relationship does sound a bit strange. I thought for a moment and added, there's another thing I can't understand. Thomas Taylor keeps changing their residence every so often. I don't know what he's trying to guard against. Christopher Carter looked at me seriously. After hesitating for a moment, he finally said, what I'm about to say next, you should mentally prepare yourself for. He pulled out a document from the folder he was carrying. This photo was taken at the dance studio, where Thomas Taylor's ex-girlfriend had her accident. I had heard that the girl died in a fire at the dance studio, an old facility lacking proper fire prevention measures. When the flames spread, the situation spiraled out of control, and the dance studio in the photo was burned beyond recognition. Had they discovered something? I asked. Christopher Carter hesitated again but eventually told me, after the dance studio burned down, because this area was remote, no one dealt with or repaired it. Later, when this area was redeveloped and investors came in, they found that the fire back then was very likely caused by human actions. At the fire scene, a piece of electrical wiring was found. The fuse in the electrical system had been deliberately cut. Chapter 3. He explained to me, this type of fuse is commonly used in old electrical circuits to prevent short circuits. If a short circuit occurs, the fuse will automatically cut off the power when it blows. The main cause of that fire was because the fuse had been tampered with, leading to a short circuit and the fire outbreak. The incident happened 2 years ago. I asked, didn't the fire department discover that the fuse had been sabotaged back then? That's precisely the issue here. Christopher Carter's gaze grew more intense. The person in charge of the fire department at that time was none other than Thomas Taylor's father. I suddenly remembered, his father really was a firefighter who just retired last year. Thinking about it, a chill ran down my spine. Thomas Taylor once spoke during a drunken state. At that time, his girlfriend was arguing with him, demanding a breakup. He had once threatened me maliciously. He said that if I dared to leave him, my fate would be the same as his ex-girlfriend's. Back then, I thought he was just drunk. But the more I think about it now, the more I feel something was off. Thankfully, we broke up. I can't imagine what could have happened if I had stayed with him. Christopher Carter stood up and walked around my room. This is an old apartment complex, the security isn't very good. I suggest you find another place to stay. I gave a bitter smile. Chief Carter, given my current situation, not having to sleep on the streets is already a blessing. I still hadn't secured next month's hospital fees for my mother. I needed to quickly find a new job. If Miss Lewis doesn't mind, I have an empty house available. The safety there is quite good. The so-called quite good safety actually meant it was directly across from Christopher Carter's apartment. Having a police officer nearby 24/7 ensured that no troublemakers would dare approach. I hesitated for a moment before deciding to set aside my fragile pride and accept his offer. After all, preserving my life was the most important thing. After the incident at the cemetery last time, Christopher Carter's mother also got to know me. Fortunately, she was quite kind-hearted. Seeing that I was living alone, she often brought food over for me. Thanks to my previous experience, I quickly found a high-paying job. On the weekend, after paying off the hospital fees and leaving the hospital, I unexpectedly ran into the parents of my ex-boyfriend, Thomas Taylor. The two of them stumbled into the hospital, looking utterly confused in front of the large automatic registration machine. I took the initiative to step forward and help. The old lady recognized me, her face showing she wanted to say something but held back. As I turned to leave, she suddenly called out to me, "Young lady, you're a good person. But remember, there are things in life you must look at carefully with open eyes." I nodded, "I understand. Thank you, ma'am." Her eyes seemed vacant, staring blankly ahead. When I got home, I happened to run into Christopher Carter returning from work. In front of his house stood a tall young woman waiting. Mrs. Carter pulled the young woman by the hand and introduced her. "Christopher, this is Aunt Wong's daughter. She's been waiting for you for quite some time." The young woman shyly glanced at him. "Captain Carter, do you remember me?" Accidentally stumbling upon this matchmaking scene, I quickly turned to leave, only for Christopher Carter to suddenly call out to me. "Hannah Lewis, didn't we agree to go out together later?" I was holding the groceries I'd just bought from the supermarket. He gave me a quick wink, and I immediately replied, "Yes, I'm coming now." We strolled around the streets for a while before heading back home, only to be stopped by Mrs. Carter at the door. "When did this start?" I was about to explain, but Christopher Carter quickly spoke up. "Just recently." His mother slapped her thigh in excitement. "Why didn't Mom notice?" Saying that, she took out her phone and cancelled all of his upcoming blind dates. Afterward, Christopher Carter, feeling a bit awkward, explained, "Recently, there's been too much going on. I really didn't want to go to those blind dates, so I asked for your help. Once the Thomas Taylor case is resolved, I'll explain everything to my mom." Since he had helped me before, I naturally couldn't refuse him. In the days that followed, we developed a tacit understanding in our companionship. Christopher Carter would take me to work in the morning before heading to the police station. Then, at 5 p.m., he would pick me up as usual when my workday ended. This routine continued for several days, completely thwarting Thomas Taylor's attempts to meet me alone. As a result, I remained safe and sound for a whole month. Finally, just when I thought everything had settled down, the hospital suddenly called me. "Ms. Lewis, your boyfriend has arrived to help your mother with the hospital transfer procedures. She's being moved to People's Hope Hospital. Are you coming right away?" I was utterly shocked. My boyfriend? What's going on? The person in charge on the other end sounded confused as well. "He brought a copy of your ID and an authorization letter with your handwritten signature. Isn't this something you authorized?" I immediately responded, "No. Under no circumstances should you hand my mother over to a stranger. But, the procedures are already complete, and the ambulance from People's Hope Hospital has arrived to pick up the patient." I quickly hung up, grabbed my bag, and rushed to the hospital. But it was rush hour in the morning. The taxi was stuck in heavy traffic. I kept calling Thomas Taylor, but his phone was always off. Knowing his reckless and obsessive nature, capable of doing anything, I could only resort to texting him, pleading for him not to harm my mother. By the time I reached the hospital, my mother had already been taken away. The hospital shirked responsibility, claiming that Thomas Taylor had presented an authorization letter with my signature and a copy of my ID, which they said was sufficient proof to allow the transfer. There was no time to argue. My only option was to report the incident to the police. A deep sense of helplessness surged within me. My mother was my sole emotional anchor in this world. I couldn't bear to imagine what I'd do if anything happened to her. Would I even have the courage to go on living? Soon, Thomas Taylor called. "Hannah, let's get back together. I really can't live without you." Without hesitation, I agreed. "All right, where are you? I'll come find you. Please, just don't hurt my mother." He laughed smugly on the other end of the line. "All right, I know it. Deep down, you still care about me. I'll send you the address. You must arrive within an hour, remember, come alone. If you dare bring that damn cop along, I can't guarantee your mother will still be alive to see you." Those words hit me right where it hurts. Just then, Christopher Carter called. I hesitated for a moment but still picked up. He told me to stay put, he had left the police station and was on his way. But I couldn't take the risk. Thomas Taylor was a madman. If I didn't make it within the hour, my mother might truly lose her life. Chapter 4. I immediately took a taxi to the agreed location. Thomas Taylor had purchased a small villa in the suburbs. Following the address, I rang the doorbell. Shortly after, he came down to open the door for me. Thomas Taylor took my phone, powered it off, and removed the SIM card. "Welcome, Hannah. From now on, this will be our home." I coldly replied, "Where is my mother? I need to see her safe first." He nodded and gestured for me to come in. I noticed a pair of ballet shoes near the door. Judging by their condition, they likely belonged to his ex-girlfriend. Thomas Taylor carefully placed my shoes next to them. Then, he nodded in satisfaction and said, "Hannah, has anyone ever told you that your feet are perfect for ballet?" I kept a cold expression, saying nothing, which only seemed to intrigue him further. He bent down, gently brushing the back of my foot. "The arch of your foot is beautiful too. Truly, a remarkable pair of feet." I fought the urge to kick this man and suppress the nausea rising in me. "I want to see my mother," I said firmly. He opened the door to the basement. My mother was locked inside, looking frail and weak. In a faint voice, she called my name. Hannah, you shouldn't have come here. He's a madman. My mother, paralyzed and bedridden for years, couldn't possibly endure such a traumatic situation. I tried to reassure her, don't worry, Mom. I'll get you out of here right away. Thomas Taylor's request was very simple. Let's get back together, you move in here with me, and I'll act like nothing ever happened before. I pretended to agree, faking compliance, and he seemed very satisfied with my attitude. If only Daisy Lohan were as obedient as you. I couldn't guess his mood. I had no choice but to temporarily play the role of his girlfriend. Feigning annoyance, I said, still thinking about your ex-girlfriend at this point, Thomas Taylor? You really are such a flirt. He laughed and pointed to the oil painting hanging on the wall. Hannah, she wasn't as obedient as you, so. Thomas Taylor leaned close to my ear, whispering like a devil. So, only when she's dead will she truly listen. In the oil painting on the wall, a girl is dancing, her figure graceful, but her face obscured by a mysterious, dim light. I didn't dare to stare for too long, a chill ran down my spine. Thomas Taylor shut all the windows and doors of the villa, forbidding me from stepping outside even a single step. Worried about my mother's safety, I could only comply obediently. Time ticked by second. Gradually, he let his guard down around me. Hannah, as long as you don't leave me, we can live here forever. He opened his laptop and began planning for our future life. Suddenly, a photo slipped out from a notebook. The photo, stained with dried blood, made Thomas Taylor's gaze instantly darken. Ah, this is a photo of Daisy Lohan and that man. So this is where it ended up. In the picture were his ex-girlfriend and another man, leaning close to each other. The photo had been taken a month before the fire incident. I cautiously probed, you didn't set the dance studio on fire because she betrayed you, did you? Hearing my words, he let out a strange laugh. Hannah, do you know what I like most about you? You're smart and sensible, much more so than Daisy Lohan. In my mind, I began calculating every second, every minute. Before coming here, I had sent my location to Christopher Carter. He's probably on his way now. Thomas Taylor won't let me go. Whether or not I comply with his demands today, my fate remains the same. It's the same as his ex-girlfriend's, reduced to ashes in death. He wants to express his eternal love. When I saw that oil painting, I understood. The painter of that artwork was once an extreme religious fanatic. In the end, to protect his art, he burned himself to death. Before his self-immolation, that artist once preached a theory: in this world, genuine emotions are unpredictable and ever-changing. Only by burning them in the most sincere moment, fixing that sincerity through death, can one achieve eternity in the physical sense. Thomas Taylor wants to kill me. I tried to stall, just to buy some time for myself and my mom. As expected, he was gradually losing patience. He closed his notebook and asked, Hannah, you said you love me. Are you willing to die for me? I cursed inwardly, damn it. But outwardly, I had to reply, of course, I'm willing to die for you. He was very happy because I comforted him. Gently, he reached out and ran his hand through my hair. That's good. I really want to keep you here a little longer. As soon as I entered the house, I noticed the yard was filled with flammable wood and barrels of gasoline. Just a single spark, and this place could go up in flames instantly. He stared intently at me. Then, he pulled a lighter out of his pocket, lit it, and threw it out the window. The fire erupted almost immediately. Thomas Taylor grabbed my hand forcefully, all right, then let's die together. Finally, his true nature was revealed, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Quickly, I pulled out the folding knife I had prepared in my pocket and, without hesitation, stabbed him. Thomas Taylor couldn't dodge in time and kept retreating. I seized the opportunity to run down to the basement and rescue my mother. But by then, the outside was already filled with thick smoke. Alone, supporting my mother, I couldn't get us out. My mother struggled and said, Hannah, don't worry about me. Run, my dear. If one of us escapes, that's enough. Don't say such foolish things. If today truly ends in misfortune, dying here is something I cannot avoid. I've lived with my mother since I was 8 years old. She has been almost my entire reason to keep going. My mother and I staggered forward through the thick smoke. Her legs had no strength left, relying solely on my support to take a few more steps. The flames grew fiercer and fiercer. Finally, both of us collapsed to the ground, utterly exhausted. At that moment, I suddenly felt the urge to laugh. When people reach the depths of despair, not only can they no longer cry, but they might even want to laugh out loud. My mother struggled to lean over and shield my head. Hannah, it's all my fault. I couldn't protect you. If I hadn't dragged you into this, you wouldn't have to suffer like this. Chapter 5. Inside, I felt an overwhelming calm. Accepting fate, I said, it's okay. Mom, we'll reincarnate together, and in the next life, we might even be sisters. My mother smiled. The journey on the Yellow Springs Road, who can predict what will happen? I held her hand tightly. Don't worry, in the next life, I'll be the mother. Facing death, I realized how much I owed her in this lifetime. If it weren't for me dating someone like Thomas Taylor, she wouldn't have to suffer alongside me today. Suddenly, I noticed the intense heat around us subsiding, and the thick smoke gradually dissipating. A cool sensation appeared above us. It was water from the fire hoses pouring into the house. Christopher Carter came into view. He and another officer swiftly carried my mother and me outside. By now, the fire had been brought under control, and firefighters were cleaning up the scene. I narrowly escaped death, hugging my mother and sobbing uncontrollably. After crying, I couldn't help but laugh. It turned out, the spot where we had collapsed was not far from the exit, just a few more steps, and we could have made it out ourselves. Christopher Carter escorted us to the ambulance. At the hospital, after undergoing examinations, we were fortunate to find that we hadn't inhaled much smoke and had no serious issues. A bit later, Christopher Carter and his colleagues from the police station came to take our statements. Thomas Taylor has been arrested. You can rest assured now, he said. I let out a sigh of relief. Thank you, Officer Carter. He nodded gently and asked softly, Are you feeling uncomfortable anywhere? No, everything is fine now. I thanked him repeatedly, and he simply smiled. After taking oxygen in the hospital room and finishing my statement, I began to understand the entire case. The fire at Thomas Taylor's ex-girlfriend's dance studio was indeed caused by him. At that time, the girl wanted to break up with him and quickly started dating another man. Thomas Taylor felt betrayed. After several attempts to visit the dance studio, to apologize without success, he developed the idea of murder. Later, his ex-girlfriend truly died in a fire, and he secretly manipulated her parents. During every holiday, he would visit them, just to ensure they wouldn't investigate the cause of their daughter's death. After his ex-girlfriend's death, he pretended to be deeply in love, often visiting the cemetery to mourn her. Until the day I suggested breaking up. His murderous intent flared up again, leading him to make several attempts on my life. This time, he nearly burned me and my mother alive in the mansion. Even the oil painting in the mansion was created using the ashes of his ex-girlfriend. No wonder the painting became more horrifying the longer you looked at it. The police officer taking my statement asked me to sign and then joked, Miss Lewis, your life was saved by Captain Carter. You'll have to repay him well someday. Christopher Carter shot him a glare. Stop spouting nonsense and take the statement back to the station. The other officer muttered in dissatisfaction, I'm not wrong, though. You've always paid close attention to this case and Miss Lewis, following it for 2 years. Otherwise. The young police officer hadn't even finished his sentence before Christopher Carter sent him out. He looked a bit flustered, don't listen to him, I was just doing my duty. Suddenly, everything became clear to me. It turned out that our first meeting at the cemetery wasn't a coincidence. That day, to provoke Thomas Taylor, I had randomly chosen a grave to cry at. Christopher Carter must have already been aware of our movements. That's why he showed up there. The subsequent encounters weren't coincidences either, once when I was threatened with a knife on the street and called for his help, and another when Thomas Taylor came to my house, and he came to rescue me. Afterward, he even arranged for me to stay in the apartment across from his. None of these events were random. They were all part of what he had quietly orchestrated. Christopher Carter awkwardly explained, "At first, I just thought the case of the dance studio fire seemed very suspicious. So, he began investigating and discovered that the chain of evidence back then was incomplete. It wasn't enough to convict Thomas Taylor, but gradually, he realized that Thomas Taylor did indeed have a motive for the crime. That's when he started paying attention to me. Being a very meticulous police officer, he focused on many details of the case, which allowed him to pinpoint the right moments. And save me just in time. When you broke up with Thomas Taylor, I realized there might be some problems, though I never expected him to go this far. Before Thomas Taylor's deranged personality was exposed, he was considered an ideal boyfriend in every way. But when a love rooted in control spirals out of control, it turns into a sharp blade aimed directly at me. It was my carelessness for not realizing this sooner. After the incident, Mother Carter also came to visit me at the hospital. She held my hand and said with heartfelt sympathy, "Oh dear, such a good girl, how could you end up in such trouble?" Mother Carter, who appeared tough but was soft-hearted, hadn't even been upset when she learned that Christopher Carter had used my name to turn down a confession in the past. She could only sigh deeply. I wonder when this boy of mine will finally settle down. Perhaps it's because the ancestral burial site isn't in a good location. When Qingming Festival comes, I'll invite a feng shui master to take a look and maybe move the grave a little. Christopher Carter helplessly interjected, "Mom, can you stop messing with the ancestral graves?" She retorted firmly, "Your father down in the afterlife hasn't even blessed you with a marriage yet. It's all his fault, really. I just checked, and there's an empty spot right next to your father's grave. I'm planning to buy it and move his grave over there." Wait a second, next to it? Isn't that the grave beside Thomas Taylor's ex-girlfriend? Out of reflex, I glanced at Christopher Carter. He responded with a subtle, knowing nod. We both fell silent. That empty plot had always been reserved, arranged by Thomas Taylor himself. Perhaps it was meant for me. He wanted to kill me so I could stay forever beside his ex-girlfriend. I immediately held Mrs. Carter's hand tightly. "Auntie, listen to me. There's no need to move the grave. Officer Carter and I are really dating." Mrs. Carter was taken aback, then slapped her thigh. "You're right. My son's room has your picture hanging every day. There's no way he doesn't have feelings for you." "Mom, I've told you, that's just case evidence." The sunlight streamed through the window. The golden hue of the sunset fell upon his police uniform, accentuating his handsome face, making it even more resolute and righteous. For the past 2 years, Christopher Carter had frequently appeared by my side, yet I had completely failed to notice. Just like my feelings for him, which had suddenly erupted without my awareness. A hint of surprise flashed across Christopher Carter's face, but soon after, he smiled gently. He carried an air of someone who blended into the bustling city, not easily noticeable in ordinary times, but always present when needed. This gave me an incredible sense of security. We had come together in such a dramatic way. Both families were overjoyed. After the previous incident, my mother was very pleased that I had a boyfriend working in government service who had passed the national exams. She often reminded me, out there, people from all walks of life can't be trusted. Officer Carter is a party member, being with him is the best choice. After Thomas Taylor was arrested, he repeatedly requested to see me. After being discharged from the hospital, I went to the prison to meet him once. He looked much thinner, staring at me with a haunting smile. "Hannah Lewis, you're truly lucky to have someone save you from my grasp." "That's right. Unlike you, I won't spend the rest of my life in prison." He laughed carelessly. "What a pity. You didn't die, and the grave I prepared remains empty. No problem. Save it for yourself. I'm sure you'll need it soon enough. Thomas Taylor laughed, still as sharp as ever. I ignored him, stood up, and prepared to leave. He suddenly added, actually, that day at South Cross Cemetery, I was planning to kill you. The tools were all ready. If it weren't for that cop, I would have done it. Don't think I don't know. He went there on purpose that day, he's been keeping an eye on me for a long time. I only felt a cold wind sweep down my back. That day at South Cross Cemetery, I had proactively suggested breaking up with him. So that day, he had the intention to kill me. I didn't dare stay in the prison for long and hurriedly left. After Thomas Taylor was arrested, the parents of his ex-girlfriend came to meet me once. They thanked me for seeking justice for their daughter. Over the years, they had lived in fear and sorrow. Life had been incredibly difficult. After Thomas Taylor was arrested, his father was also taken into custody for providing false testimony in the fire case back then. His mother couldn't accept this outcome and soon moved out of the city. Justice had been served, and everything returned to normal. Half a year after the case concluded, Christopher Carter and I officially decided to get married. It might sound strange, but after being together, everything seemed to happen so naturally. He understood me, sometimes even better than I understood myself. He even knew that I went to a bakery every Friday to buy Basque cake. Actually, ever since you started dating Thomas Taylor, I've been keeping track of your every move, he said. So, he had known me for a long time. I joked, did you fall for me back then? Christopher Carter suddenly nodded seriously. I once thought, if my assumptions about this case were wrong and Thomas Taylor turned out to be a good person, I would never interfere in your lives. Fortunately, all his deductions were reasonable and accurate. From the arson at the dance studio to the later mansion fire, Thomas Taylor was nothing less than a murderer. I suddenly felt lucky to have escaped death, truly fortunate that everything was still in time. Christopher Carter's love for me was always hidden beneath the guise of safety. Never actively approaching to disturb me, but always appearing when I needed him most. Thank you, Mr. Carter. He was like a compensatory ticket that fate had granted me. Just like that day on the street, when I unconsciously called out husband simply to seek help. Now, that has become reality.